Hi, I'm Simon Garnett.
And I'm Laura Halliday.
And this is The Persuasion Game, the Forge's podcast all about the art of persuasion.
Each episode, we connect with marketers, business leaders, and beyond to learn how they use persuasion to influence their consumers, convince their stakeholders, and drive their business forward. Hello, Simon.
Hi, Laura. Lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you. But let's cut to the chase. How do you feel about self-promotion?
So are you asking me to talk about modesty and why I'm so good at it?
Well, this is a very interesting topic, isn't it? Because we, like the majority of our listeners, are likely to spend an enormous amount of time thinking about how we promote products, how we promote our clients' products, but actually promoting ourselves gives us the enormous ick.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think it's one of the sort of the ironies that our work, our industry tends to gravitate towards those insecure overachievers where every project is an opportunity either for validation or, sadly, quite often a bit of sort of self-flagellation and doubt about one's own ability and competence.
Absolutely. And this is true for everyone, but especially for women. There was a study that found 59% of women in the UK feel uncomfortable with self-promotion. I actually think they got the digits the wrong way around on that one, compared to 41% of men. Arguably, they got them the wrong way around there too. The truth is that people buy people. So how do we, without veering into arrogance, persuade people to buy into us and the message we want to convey?
And to help us take a deeper dive into this, we're joined today by Alex O'Rourke, who has spent so much of her career dedicated to uplifting women, championing gender equality. She's a marketing powerhouse with over 23 years of experience across multinationals, SMEs, and startups. She's built a stellar career at Camelot, Diageo, where our paths actually crossed, and is the innovation lead at Fevertree. And Alex now channels her expertise into empowering women through LockSmith, the company she co-founded. With a passion for nurturing female talent, Alex is dedicated to coaching and developing women to achieve their brilliant best. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Let's talk a little bit up front about your very interesting career path. How did you find yourself in this brave new world of LockSmith?
So the brave new world of LockSmith has been about 4.5 years now, and LockSmith is a marketing capability and coaching business. But before I set up LockSmith, I was working client side, and I was a marketeer for, probably 23 years, actually. And I spent 10 really interesting years at Camelot, learning from the best, all about mainly marketing communications. I did some innovation there as well. And then I moved to Diageo. And then the latter half of my time at Diageo, I moved into an innovation role, and I was innovation director for Europe, working again on a whole host of wonderful brands.
And now you're working on something quite different as a proposition. Tell us a bit about LockSmith.
We are a marketing capability and coaching business. And when Chris, my co-founder, and I were client side as marketing leaders, we always found that you can't deliver marketing growth unless you've got a brilliant team behind you. And our favourite thing was growing the people in our team. So we set up LockSmith to do exactly that, the thing that we loved most, to grow the people behind the brands. And that's what we do today.
So Alex, that thought of growing people is fascinating because obviously part of that is just learning the skills, but there's a bigger dimension to that around, I guess, sort of engendering belief and helping that team think that they're capable and getting over some of those kind of barriers. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you engage with some of those sort of deeper motivations that may be impacting the way we behave and how we go about doing our job?
Yeah, so I'm also a trained transformational life coach. And what that training helped me do was exactly as you said there, Simon, kind of go a little bit deeper and unpick the surface stuff and really understand, why people think what they do, because very rarely do we kind of get that far into it. So I guess my work splits into two themes, if you like. I'm as a transformational life coach, I help people grow on a one-to-one basis, and I do a lot of work with women in particular to help them be brilliant, and that does involve some really kind of deep-rooted work around what makes you tick. But actually, on the other side of things, I do a lot of training with larger groups on more practical stuff. So the marketing training. But that also requires them to shift the way they think and behave. So the whole concept of behavior and behavior change is integral to marketing, and any marketer needs to understand that. So it's our job as marketing trainers to teach people how that works, so they can put that into play themselves.
That's fascinating because I think you're right. That is the definition of marketing, isn't it? It's changing behavior in the favor of your brand and category. Yet, I'm guessing that from your own experience, you would suggest that we're not always terribly good at that as applying that to ourselves.
No, we're probably not. A lot of the time, we don't take the time to stop and think about ourselves, because we put ourselves at the bottom of a priority list, or we don't carve out time for our own self-development or self-reflection. And it does require you to do that. So if you're thinking about marketing at work and your consumer, you spend hours and hours understanding your consumer and what makes them tick. I wonder how many of us spend the same amount of time on ourselves, understanding ourselves and what makes us tick. And I would venture probably not many of us.
Do you think specifically women have particular issues in finding this idea of self-promotion difficult, or is it the self-reflection piece? What do you think it is that is a particular challenge for women?
For women, I find it's very often a confidence issue, and there's a lot wrapped up in confidence. So that's a word that means different things to different people. But for me, confidence is having self-belief. It's about being resilient. It's about bouncing back. It's not being scared to take risks. And I do see a lot of women struggling with that at various points in their career. In fact, I struggled with it myself. And there's lots of reasons for that, lots of endemic reasons that stem back to how women are generally encouraged, or how girls are encouraged to be at school. They're always encouraged to be, kind of quiet and well-behaved and heads down. And boys are just accepted to be boisterous and noisy and a bit disruptive. And that's kind of the way it is. And very often those behaviors get taken through, into adulthood. And it's what you see play out in an office environment where women often take the back seat and men don't. But it's also, lots of other things when lots of girls drop out of sport and team sports in particular. And that's where a lot of positive behaviors are learned, things like competition or risk taking, dealing with loss, resilience. And that follows through into adulthood as well. So very often you see women starting their career without as much self-belief, self-reliance, confidence and resilience. And that does play out. Unless you're able to correct it, or unless you're in an environment that recognizes that and makes sure that, everybody is heard.
So thinking about, a personal story about where you had to overcome your own hesitations, what can you think of?
I've had a lot in the course of my career, and I think it's really important to talk about this, because going back to the point about social media and painting brilliant pictures, it's not been easy. So in my late 20s, I was plagued with a huge lack of confidence and self-belief, and that really hindered me. And then in my mid-30s, when I had my children, I really struggled with the juggle and this belief that I should be able to do everything well, and just was failing miserably. In my later 30s, I really struggled with work politics and cutting through and self-promoting in the way that I needed to in the environment that I was. And then, in my early 40s, I was one of very few women on a leadership team in a very male-dominated environment. And that was probably, the most difficult time for me, because I'd spent a couple of years going in feeling really confident in myself in my early 40s, but then in an environment where I was questioned and not listened to and talked over, wasn't invited into forums, and I felt incredibly excluded, very lonely in that environment. And I started to question my own abilities. Why wasn't I being involved and asked? Why aren't people listening to me? And, a couple of years of that really ebbs away at even the most confident person. And I ended up being made redundant very out of the blue after a couple of years. And And it absolutely knocked me for six. My confidence was through the floor. And whilst, of course, with hindsight, it was a good thing to have happened, it never feels like that at the time. And yeah, I was at rock bottom there, having spent 2 years of being gradually undermined, despite being someone who generally has, good levels of confidence these days. So that was, I think, a particularly difficult time for me.
And what was the journey like to get back from there, Alex? Who did you turn to? What kind of conversations were you having? What helped you regain some of that belief and that confidence?
So I think it's fair to say that it took me a good few weeks of just feeling sorry for myself. And I think sometimes you just need to crawl into that pain cave and embrace it. And I took a few weeks just to bolster myself and until I felt ready to think about the future. And then I did what I teach everyone else to do. I went back to my personal basics, and I actually remember doing a really uplifting exercise in my dining room where I'd put lots of posters up around the room and I mind mapped all the things that I loved, all the things I was good at, all the things I enjoyed. And then I had to think about, well, what do I want to do? If I could create a role from scratch, what would it look like? What would I be doing? And I spent a lot of time thinking about what I love, what I'm good at, what I need from a business, from the people around me, and then a little bit of a visualization about, well, what would that look like? Rather than remembering all the crappy stuff and listening to the negative voices, I went back and looked at the evidence of what I'd delivered and realized that, actually, I am bloody good and I've done some really good stuff. And I guess got myself back on my horse when it comes to, that self-belief. And then it also really helped me in a practical level because I was able to write down all the things that I was loved and looking for in my next role. And I didn't know what that role was. There wasn't anything that sprung to mind, in fact, but I just went out and had lots of curious conversations with people because I was very clear on what I love when I'm at my best, what I enjoy doing. So that's what I was looking for. And I was also very clear on what I don't want to do, the environments that don't suit me, the things I absolutely won't compromise on now. And with those two things hand in hand, it's very easy to go out and have conversations to people and say, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. How can you help? Or what are your ideas?
I'd love to talk about that a little bit more in terms of the narratives and the stories. It sort of sounds to me like almost what you did was strip out everything else. You stripped out the voices, you stripped out other people's narratives, and went back to your narrative and what was it that was about you that you could control rather than being influenced by other people and trying to interpret or make sense of things, which inevitably we're incredibly limited about what we can understand because we just don't live anyone else's reality. You
have to come back in those moments to what you can control. You can't control what other people think of you. You can't control what they're doing, but you can control your reaction to it and you can control what you do in that moment. And my choice was to go back and do some really deep self-reflection. And I think at any time it pays off, but I think when you're in a dark place, to be able to do that is, a really therapeutic exercise.
So thinking about some of those self-reflection tools, Alex, I know you're a big proponent of DISC, which is something I've talked to a lot of people about since I've had a lot of fun guessing people's colours. I'm quite good at it, actually. But maybe you can tell everyone a little bit about how it works and how it serves you in your LockSmith experiences.
So for those people who don't know what DISC is, it's a behavioural profiling tool that assesses people's behavioural and communication styles. And you can use it in lots of different ways. But first and foremost, it's just a great way of understanding how other people tick. And I'm sure we've all been in situations where you've been talking to somebody and you just don't understand why they're not getting it. Why do you not get it? And there's a brilliant book called Surrounded by Idiots, which I think encapsulates that thought entirely. You can be sat around listening to people thinking, just, what planet are they on? And And it will boil down essentially to the fact that everybody has different preferences in the way that they communicate. And it's not just about being introverted and extroverted, although that's part of it, but there's lots of different dimensions to this tool. And it's very clever, yet very simple, but it does help you. It profiles every individual and gives you a unique view of how you like to communicate. But then you can also use that to help understand others better as well. So you can have an individual profile where you get to understand, your strengths, your spikes, your preferences, so that you can then really focus on making your strengths stronger. So the DISC profiles are a great way of helping you understand what you're great at, and highlighting the blind spots is where you need them to as well. But then you can use them as a team as well and see how your preferences differ across the team, help you understand one another much better, help you leverage your total skills as a team. I use it on a day-to-day level, even with my family, with my husband. I mean, we argue far less now we understand each other's DISC profiles.
So can you give us an example of where that has worked well for you? I get the impression you and Chris work in complementary ways in that front. How would two people who are seemingly very different work together in a harmonious way?
So I am very high yellow, which means, very, very high energy, full of ideas, full of enthusiasm, very extrovert, and get my energy from, being around others and, being in ideas phase an awful lot. Chris, on the other hand, is very blue, and he's very in the detail. He's very organized. He likes to know exactly what is happening and when, and is just a fantastic deliverer. So we complement each other because I'm very high energy and have lots of ideas, and whereas he makes sure all those ideas happen and are executed brilliantly. So there's a great complement there. But what that can also mean is that if I'm getting too yellow, he finds it very frustrating. Or if he's trying to drag me too far into the detail, I find that very frustrating. So, when we do find each other bristling or prickling, which isn't very often, but when we do, it can normally be explained using our DISC profiles and understanding if we're, leaning into one of our behavioral preferences too much or too little, and that's rubbing each other up the wrong way. But normally it's actually really helps us leverage our strengths even more. I do wish that I had done DISC profiling for myself and my husband before we renovated our house, because it would have saved us a whole lot of arguments. Yeah. It's about the only thing we've ever argued over, and it was all entirely explainable by our DISC profiles.
Yeah, I think Kathy, my wife, would definitely agree with that, although I'm not sure she would necessarily say that it makes it any better. My desire just to start random DIY jobs and then just get bored and move off. But anyway, enough of that.
So that's all extremely fascinating, Alex. And, to the point we've made, that works personally and professionally. I want to just zone in on that professional piece and think about, what if you're in an environment where people do have very different behaviors to you, and perhaps you're working for the same goal, but you feel like you're not cutting through. What kind of tips do you give to people to how to use self-reflection as a way of persuading and promoting yourself?
Unless you spend the time to truly understand what is going on for the other people in that dynamic, you won't be able to change their behavior. You won't be able to influence, because being able to influence people relies entirely on understanding what buttons to push or what levers to pull. And you won't get that unless you understand what's going on in their world and what matters to them and what pushes their buttons, because it might be a style thing. So, for example, going back to behavioral preferences, if you've got a room full of people who are quite reserved and very detail orientated and just want to get stuff done and drive ahead, and you're somebody who's wants to talk and discuss ideas and stay in that lovely ideation space, then they're going to be very frustrated with you and they're not going to want to engage, and you're not going to be able to get the result you want. Sometimes it's about style, and DISC can help you pull that out. But sometimes it's even deeper than that. Sometimes it's just a fundamental misalignment of beliefs. And that, goes deeper. And that's where you need to have, a genuinely open conversation with somebody.
I want to just talk about this challenge around self-promotion, a word that, as we say, lots of us probably find it very difficult. What I wanted to ask you is, what's the relationship between self-promotion and self-worth, perceptions of self-worth?
I think it's almost starting the other way around. I think you have to have a degree of self-worth to be comfortable with self-promotion, because it's very difficult to promote yourself if you don't actually believe that. And that's where, self-belief and self-worth comes in. But I think also there's this sense of, for a lot of people, it's very uncomfortable blowing your own trumpet. The sad fact is that unless you do, it's unlikely others will. And you might be very lucky at points in your career where you do have a very vocal sponsor, or you do have a line manager or someone above you who takes the time to come and understand what you're doing. But a good friend of mine, Jill Whitty-Collins, who's written a brilliant book about gender equality called Why Men Win at Work, talks about this idea of the umbrella theory. And she says that many women, although it doesn't have to be women, anyone lacking in confidence will sit under their umbrella, work really, really hard, and just assume that hard work will get you the recognition that you need. But the sad reality is that isn't always the case. And unless whoever is sat on top of your umbrella, your boss, your line manager, the leaders in the business, see what's going on underneath it, you won't get the recognition in its entirety. So if they're not coming down under your umbrella, and the chances are they're probably not, you need to make sure that you're coming out from under it and you are showcasing what you are doing. It's just being very practical about the fact that you've worked hard and you want people to see what you're doing. And I think when you understand that concept and the reality of the world that we're operating in, it can give you a little bit more impetus to do something about it. And like anything, it's always uncomfortable at first, but the more you do it, the easier it becomes.
It's interesting that this is all happening at a time where there's a lot of different conversations about styles of leadership. Politically, globally, we see a sort of move culturally towards sort of service leadership, but then we also see like that kind of strongman 80s style, like command and control is still very endemic. So I'm interested to see what you think needs to happen within corporate cultures for leaders, different styles of leaders that aren't necessarily comfortable with sort of coming out and being like, this is how I'm going to do things. What do you think needs to be in place for those people to thrive? What would you like to see the change?
Well, a question back to you, Laura, if I may, actually, because I think there's a
What
difference.
do I want to see change, Simon? I need to.
No, but hearing you say that, I do think leaders need to be comfortable with being very clear and confident with their vision and what they want to happen. Good leadership is about being very clear about what you want to happen. The way in which you deliver your outcomes and you empower people to deliver that is where leadership style comes in. So whether you're, a directive, authoritative leader telling people how you want it to get done, or, you're a more inspiring, empowering leader and you're creating a team and a vision and getting them to, lead that for you. I don't think it changes the fact that as a leader, you need to set a clear vision and direction. The leadership styles as to how you do that is where the difference is. And actually, it's been proved that strong leaders, good leaders, one of the biggest drivers of successful leadership is high EQ, emotional quotient or emotional intelligence. And it's that style of leadership that has now been scientifically proved to be the most effective. I mean, my belief is that is where, effective leadership sits.
One of the things I'm always fascinated about is language. And it strikes me that throughout our conversation, there's the stories you're telling, the anecdotes you've heard, the feedback you're getting from the people that you work with. Quite often, a lot of that language feels quite binary. It's quite extreme language. I'm not boastful. I'm not blowing my own trumpet. I'm not, I don't want to be loud and saying, look at me. And I'm fascinated about how you go about confronting some of those, particularly when you're talking about constructing your own narrative. My guess is quite a lot of the time, actually, some of our narrative is quite dominated either by binary black and white language, or actually quite often by what it's not, what we're not, rather than necessarily what we are. And I'm fascinated just to hear any tips, thoughts you have about how we can use language to our advantage in writing that narrative rather than letting it hinder us and hold us back.
So I wonder if there's two parts to that, Simon. There's the bit about language, which I'll come on to, because I agree it's incredibly powerful language. You know, how you talk to yourself is just one of the biggest defining ways that you can build confidence. But the assumptions and the narratives that you're talking about there are the limiting beliefs that we all have. You know, the voices in our heads, the things that say, I can't do that, I'm not good enough, that's not for me. You know, those, we all have them. We all have them. And they're really damaging because we don't realize we have them. And often they're so ingrained and deep rooted that they appear without us even thinking about it. And it's very difficult to shift those, but it can absolutely be done. And it comes back again to taking a step back, doing a little bit of self-reflection, getting some feedback, and often, you know, working with somebody who can challenge you, who can challenge your assumptions, call them out, challenge them and work them through. And very often you'll find that they aren't founded on evidence at all. You know, thoughts aren't facts. And if you go back to the facts, you look for evidence to disprove some of your helpful narratives or prove out some of your more helpful hypothesis, then that's how you go about shifting those limiting beliefs and replacing them with more helpful narratives. But it's not an easy thing. And often, you know, you do need a little bit of help to do it, but it's entirely possible. So language is extremely important. And the type of language we use not only says an awful lot to other people who hear it, but it also reflects on ourselves as well. We will believe what we are saying. And one of the things I often say to my coachees is you must talk to yourself as if you were talking to your best friend. Would you say that to your best friend? If not, you don't say it to yourself. You know, kind, thoughtful, helpful, constructive language to yourself. And then the way you talk outwardly will come across far more confidently as well.
What about people who are facing unexpected transitions? I see a lot on LinkedIn about people saying like either the freelance world is very challenging or, you know, they thought they had a job and they don't have a job. What kind of manifesto would you be encouraging?
So first and foremost, make sure you have your manifesto. You know, what is your point of view? What do you stand for? What is your personal brand? What's your elevator pitch? But then it's ask for help. And it's very difficult, I think, for a lot of people to ask for help. But I've had to learn to ask for help more recently. And I can tell you it's absolutely game changing. And what I've realized, and what I knew deep down anyway, was that people love helping people. So pick up the phone, have the conversation, make the ask for the introduction, ask for the coffee, whatever it might be, you know, ask for help. And don't put too much pressure on yourself because it is difficult. I'm a firm believer in, you know, what goes around comes around. And I think if you've helped others in your time, the help will come for you as well.
What a brilliant way to end it on a podcast all about persuasion, that actually one of the biggest things to do is ask for help. Alex, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your wisdom and insight today.
My pleasure. I've loved it. Thank you both.
Thank you, Alex. It's great.
So, Laura, a lot to reflect on there. What's stuck with you?
I think what was really interesting was, we all know people who've done their job for such a long time that they can get really focused on their KPIs and what they're not good at, and actually thinking about not only your strengths, but what is your narrative of yourself, the self you want to put into the world of work, the future you want to create for yourself. And just really having that as a story in the same way that you would create a story for a brand felt like a really interesting way of reframing confidence. So it's almost a creative act of something you've made rather than just you sort of talking a big I am. And I thought that was a really, really great unlock, especially for women who perhaps are less comfortable with, shouting from the rooftops about everything they've ever achieved. It's all about that relevant story of the future you want.
I think that's definitely right, because confidence is so fragile. Mm-hmm. It's so easy to be eroded that actually having a story for yourself that you can go back to, that you can remind yourself of when you have those knocks, is incredibly powerful. I know for myself that if something has gone wrong and I've had that little bit of a knock of confidence, I always go back to a reminder that I say, which is 9 times out of 10, we don't do bad work. It's almost always a lack of alignment over expectations. Someone thinks we're doing one thing, we think we're doing something else. And having that story, that narrative that I can go back to help me kind of get myself back on track and build that confidence up, I know is something that I find incredibly useful.
Thanks for listening. If you'd love to hear more from marketers, entrepreneurs, and business leaders about how to use the art of persuasion to drive your business forward, make sure you're following the podcast in your favourite podcast app.
And just the last ask from us. This is a new podcast, and we'd love it if you could be persuaded to help us spread the word by telling somebody else about it, leaving us a review, or even better, sharing an episode on socials. Search for The Forge on LinkedIn.